The man lived a quiet life in a peaceful suburban neighborhood, surrounded by familiar faces and homes that looked much like his own. It was the kind of place where everyone minded their own business and the streets were lined with rows of cars parked neatly along the curb. The days were peaceful, and the sound of children playing outside and neighbors chatting over fences was a constant backdrop. To the people who lived nearby, he was just another ordinary guy. He kept to himself, rarely engaging in conversations with anyone and often keeping his routines as low-key as possible. The only exception to this was his dog. His dog was a large, imposing creature, a breed that made anyone think twice before approaching. Despite its intimidating appearance, the dog was as loyal as they come, always by the man's side, sharing in the solitude of his life. Every morning and afternoon, the man would take the dog for a walk around the neighborhood. The dog, with its alert eyes and strong presence, never strayed too far from its owner, walking close by as if guarding him from the world. The man liked these walks, simple as they were. There was a certain peace in them, a sense of normalcy that helped him forget the darker chapters of his past. No one knew much about the man's past life. He didn't talk about it, and it didn't come up in casual conversation. To the residents of the neighborhood, his quiet demeanor made him seem like just another middle-aged man with a dog. But in truth, his past was something far more complex and dangerous, something that could have shattered the calm image he had carefully built for himself. He had been a soldier, part of an elite force known as Delta Force, a unit that dealt with some of the world's most dangerous and covert missions. In that world, where every move was calculated and every decision could mean life or death, the man had earned a reputation. He was skilled, trained, and ruthless when the situation called for it. But those days were behind him now. After leaving the army, he settled into this quiet neighborhood, far from the chaos of his previous life. He'd hoped for peace, for a chance to live without the constant threat of danger, but peace had never been as simple as it seemed. The memories of his past, of the missions and the battles, still lingered in his mind. It was a world that he could never fully escape, no matter how hard he tried. That afternoon, as he walked his dog down the street, everything seemed just like any other day. The sun was low in the sky, casting a soft golden hue over the neighborhood, and the air was calm. The dog walked beside him, its tail wagging lazily as it sniffed the ground. The man glanced around at the familiar sights. The same houses, the same cars, the same quiet street. It was a moment of normalcy, something he had come to treasure. But things were about to change. As the man and his dog turned the corner onto a street they usually didn't frequent, they noticed something unusual. 2 police cars were parked near the curb, their lights flashing in the dimming light of the day. A few officers were standing around in front of one of the houses, talking amongst themselves. It was the kind of scene that caught the attention of anyone passing by, but the man didn't think much of it. He was used to the occasional police presence. Sometimes it was nothing more than a noise complaint or a minor incident. It wasn't unusual for them to be around. But then his dog began to act strangely. The dog's ears perked up, its body stiffening as it pulled on the leash, sniffing the air. The man, sensing the tension, spoke softly to the dog, trying to calm it. "It's okay," he murmured, but the dog's growl only grew louder. It wasn't the usual growl. This one was deep and filled with a sense of unease. The officers noticed the dog's behavior right away. One of them, a woman, stepped forward and called out to the man. "Sir, could you control your dog?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. The man hesitated for a moment, then turned to face her. He could see the concern in her eyes, but there was something else too. A hint of caution, perhaps even fear. The dog, though loyal, had always had a protective side, especially when it felt threatened. The man knew that in this situation, if things escalated, they could end badly. "He's fine," the man said calmly, his voice steady. He reached down to gently tug on the leash, trying to guide his dog away from the officers. "He's just a bit excited. It's nothing." But the dog wasn't having it. It continued to growl, taking a few steps closer to the officers, its eyes never leaving them. The woman officer took a step back, clearly on edge now. She wasn't sure how to react to the dog's behavior. The situation was getting tense, and the man could feel it. He could see the other officers starting to move into position, their hands inching toward their weapons. It wasn't the first time he had seen people react with fear to a large dog, and he knew it wouldn't end well if he didn't do something fast. "Please, just give him a minute," the man said. his voice firm but still trying to remain calm. He could feel the old instincts stirring within him, the part of him that had learned to stay calm in the most dangerous situations. But it didn't matter how calm he stayed. The officers were already on high alert. The woman officer took another step back, her hand hovering near her belt where her taser was holstered. The other officers, now sensing the escalating situation, also reached for their weapons. The man's heart began to race, his senses sharpening as he saw the fear in the officers' eyes. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know what he had done in his past, the training that ran through his veins. He had been in situations like this before, and he knew how quickly they could spiral out of control. He stepped forward, trying to place himself between his dog and the officers. "Please," he said, his voice still calm. "I'm telling you, he's not dangerous. Just give him a second." But the officers weren't listening. They were too focused on the perceived threat in front of them. One of them, the man noticed, was now holding a taser, aiming it at his dog. It happened so fast that the man didn't have time to react. The officer fired. The sound of the taser hitting the dog echoed in the air, and the dog let out a pained yelp. It stumbled, its legs buckling as it collapsed to the ground. The man's breath caught in his throat. He rushed to his dog's side, kneeling beside it, feeling for a pulse. The dog's body twitched slightly, but it was clear that the electric shock had taken its toll. The dog was not getting up. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The man looked at the officers, his heart pounding in his chest. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice low and trembling. The officers stood motionless, unsure of what to say. One of them, the officer who had fired the taser, stepped forward, his face filled with regret. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, his voice softer now. We thought the dog was a threat." But the man didn't hear him. He didn't care about the officer's apology. All he could think about was the dog, the animal that had been his companion, his protector, and now lay motionless in front of him. The man's hands shook as he gently cradled his dog's head in his lap, his mind racing. The officers, realizing that the situation had gone beyond what they could control, began to back away. One of them spoke into his radio calling for backup, but the man didn't pay attention. He couldn't focus on anything but the dog. His dog. The one thing in his life that had never judged him, never feared him. Now it was gone. As the man sat there cradling his dog's lifeless body, the officers looked on, unsure of what to do next. They had no idea who he was. They didn't understand that the man they had just confronted was someone whose past was filled with things far more dangerous than they could comprehend. They didn't realize that the man kneeling on the ground, his eyes filled with pain, was once one of the deadliest soldiers alive, a former member of Delta Force. Here's part 2 of the story, written in a simple and natural tone. The man sat on the ground, still holding his dog's lifeless body, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. His heart ached in a way he hadn't felt in years. It was a different kind of pain, one that wasn't just about the loss of a beloved animal, but the crushing feeling of helplessness. He had never allowed himself to feel vulnerable, never allowed himself to depend on anyone or anything. His dog had been his only constant companion, the one thing in his life that he could trust without question, and now that trust had been shattered. As he sat there cradling his dog, the world around him seemed to fade away. He wasn't aware of the officers standing nearby, their eyes filled with a mix of guilt and confusion. He wasn't aware of the people who had begun to gather at the edge of the street, drawn by the flashing lights of the police cars. All he could focus on was the loss he felt, deep, raw, and overwhelming. It felt like a part of him had been taken, and there was nothing he could do to bring it back. The officers, unsure of how to handle the situation, exchanged uneasy glances. They had been trained to deal with dangerous situations, but they had never been trained for something like this. They had made a decision, one that they thought was necessary, but now, standing in the aftermath, they weren't sure if it had been the right one. One of the officers, the one who had fired the taser, took a step forward. His face was drawn with regret, his expression softening as he looked at the man. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "We didn't mean to. We just thought." The man looked up at him, his eyes cold and distant. He didn't respond right away. He couldn't find the words. What was there to say? He could feel the anger building inside him, but he didn't want to lash out. He had seen too much violence in his life, and in that moment, It felt like the last thing he needed was more of it. Instead, he stood up slowly, still holding his dog's body, and walked toward the nearest police car. His movements were deliberate, controlled, as if he was forcing himself to remain calm, even though every fiber of his being wanted to scream. He gently placed his dog in the back of the car, his hands trembling as he did so. The officers watched him, unsure of what to do next. They had expected a different reaction, maybe an outburst, some kind of confrontation. But this man, the one they had so quickly judged as just another civilian, was showing them something they hadn't anticipated. Restraint. The tension that had filled the air moments earlier began to shift, replaced by a quiet unease. The officer who had spoken earlier cleared his throat. "We'll have to file a report," he said, his voice steady but still carrying a hint of discomfort. "I'm going to need your name and some details for the report." The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked around at the gathering crowd, some of whom had started to murmur among themselves. The sight of the police cars and flashing lights had drawn attention, and now people were starting to wonder what had happened. The man knew that the story would soon spread, that word would get out about what had just taken place. And when it did, everything would change. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "You don't need my name," he said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "I just want to go home." The officer looked at him, puzzled. "Sir, we need to take a report." "It's standard procedure." The man shook his head. "No," he replied, his voice hardening. "I don't need your procedure. I need to bury my dog." There was a long pause. The officers exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of how to proceed. They could tell that the man was not someone they could intimidate. He was composed even in the face of this tragedy. It was clear to them now that there was more to him than met the eye, something about his demeanor that made them uneasy. It was the kind of unease that came from not knowing who you were dealing with. One of the officers stepped forward, his tone more conciliatory. "Sir, we understand that you're upset. We're sorry for your loss, but we still need to take down some information." The man looked at him, his eyes narrowing. He didn't want to deal with the bureaucracy, didn't want to go through the motions of what seemed like an unnecessary formality. But he could see that the officer was just trying to do his job, so he relented. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "Do what you need to do. But I'm not giving you my name. I'm not going to make this public. I'm not interested in any of your reports." The officer nodded slowly. He could tell that the man wasn't going to make this easy, but there was something in his tone, something in his presence, that made the officer reconsider how far he could push. It wasn't fear exactly, it was more like a quiet respect, a recognition that this man wasn't someone who could be easily intimidated. "I'll get your information from the vehicle registration," the officer said quietly. "You don't have to say anything else. But we still need to document this. We'll leave you to handle things." The man nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He turned away, walking slowly back toward his house, his dog's body still in the back of the car. The officers didn't follow him, though they kept a watchful eye on him from a distance. They were still uncertain, unsure of what had just happened or what the man might do next. But as they watched him, they couldn't shake the feeling that they had just crossed paths with someone whose past was far more complicated than they could have imagined. As the man reached his front door, he paused for a moment, glancing back at the street behind him. The flashing lights of the police cars were still visible in the distance, casting a red and blue glow over the neighborhood. It felt surreal, like something out of a bad dream. He had been through so much in his life, but he had never imagined something like this happening. His dog, his only true companion, had been taken from him in a moment of fear and misjudgment. It wasn't just the loss that hurt, though. It was the sense of violation, of having his life disrupted in such a brutal, unexpected way. But there was something else brewing in the man's mind now, something that had been stirring ever since the moment the officers had arrived. The recognition that they had no idea who he was. They didn't know the depth of his past, the things he had done. They didn't know the skills he had been trained in, the places he had been, or the people he had faced down. To them, he was just a quiet man with a dog. But that could change very quickly if the situation continued to escalate. He didn't want to cause trouble. He didn't want to bring his past back into his present. But the more he thought about the events of the afternoon, the more he realized that it might be inevitable. He couldn't let this go without some kind of reckoning. Inside his house, he gently placed his dog's body on the floor and sat down beside it. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the tears come. He hadn't cried in years, not since his days in the service, but now, with his dog gone, the dam finally broke. For a long time he sat there, letting the emotions wash over him. His past, his present, and his future. All of it felt like it was collapsing into this one moment. And yet, despite everything, there was a quiet resolve growing within him. He wouldn't let this go unanswered. The officers may have thought they were dealing with just another civilian, but they were wrong. They had no idea who they had just crossed paths with, and soon they would learn that the man they had underestimated was someone they would never forget. Here's part 3 of the story. The next few days felt like a blur to the man. After that afternoon, everything had changed. He spent most of his time in the quiet of his home, processing what had happened and trying to make sense of the overwhelming emotions that seemed to have taken control. The house felt emptier now, the silence echoing through the rooms where his dog had once been. It was hard to walk through the hallways without expecting to hear the sound of paws padding behind him, or to feel the warmth of the dog's body close by. Despite the pain, he knew he couldn't let it consume him. The situation with the police had left him unsettled. He had thought about it over and over, wondering if there was something more he could have done to prevent the tragedy. But as much as he replayed the events in his mind, the truth remained. There was nothing he could have done. The officers had acted out of fear, and in doing so, they had taken something irreplaceable from him. He didn't know if the officers truly understood the weight of their actions. To them, it might have just been another call gone wrong, another unfortunate incident with an aggressive dog. But to him, it was much more than that. The loss of his dog had shaken him to his core. It wasn't just the death of an animal. It was the reminder that he couldn't fully escape his past, no matter how hard he tried. Over the next few days, the man heard whispers from his neighbors. The story had spread quickly, as things like this often do. People talked. Some were sympathetic, others less so. But the fact remained that the incident had caught the attention of the entire neighborhood. The flashing lights, the police cars, and the tragic scene were all anyone seemed to talk about. But it wasn't just the neighbors who were taking notice. The local news stations had picked up the story. It wasn't long before it gained traction, and soon it was all over social media. Videos of the police interaction had been uploaded, although the footage didn't show much, just the moments leading up to the police firing the taser at the dog. The dog's sudden fall, the man's desperate attempt to save it, and the officers standing by unsure of what to do next. The video didn't capture the whole story. It didn't show the man's years of service, the sacrifice he had made for his country, or the kind of person he was outside of the incident. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the public reaction. The man knew that sooner or later his past would come to light. He hadn't wanted it to, but he knew it was inevitable. The reporters began digging, and before long his name appeared in the headlines. The quiet man who lived on the street with his dog was no longer just a face in the crowd. He was a former member of Delta Force, one of the most elite and secretive military units in the world. His reputation was built on years of service in the most dangerous parts of the globe, but to the public it meant little. What mattered now was that he had lost something that was deeply important to him, and that loss was something the world could understand. It wasn't long before the man received a visit. It came one evening when he was sitting in his living room, the light from the television casting a faint glow on the walls. He wasn't really watching the screen. He hadn't been able to focus on much since the incident. The doorbell rang, pulling him from his thoughts. He wasn't expecting anyone, and his first instinct was to ignore it. But when the bell rang again, he stood up, his mind already running through 1,000 possibilities. He had no idea who it could be, but he knew it was time to face what was coming. He opened the door to find 2 officers standing on his doorstep. One of them was the woman who had spoken to him that day, and the other was a man he didn't recognize. The man's expression was neutral, but the woman's face was filled with a kind of remorse, as though she had been carrying the weight of the situation with her since that afternoon. "Can we talk for a moment?" the woman asked, her voice soft, but there was a tension to it, something that made the man wary. He didn't invite them inside. Instead, he stood in the doorway, arms crossed, waiting for them to explain themselves. The last thing he wanted was another conversation about that day. But he knew they wouldn't leave without saying something. "We just wanted to check in on you," the woman continued. "After what happened, we wanted to make sure you were okay. We've been discussing the incident and we think it's important we clear the air." The man raised an eyebrow. "Clear the air?" He repeated, his voice flat. "You killed my dog. There's nothing to clear." The woman looked down, clearly uncomfortable. "I know," she said quietly. "I know it was wrong, and I'm truly sorry for what happened. We never should have acted the way we did, but it's been weighing on all of us and we're trying to figure out how to make things right." The man let out a bitter laugh. "Make things right? You can't just fix this with an apology." The officer beside her stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "We understand your frustration, sir, we do. But the department is taking this seriously. There's going to be an internal review of what happened and—" He was interrupted by the man's sharp voice. "It's too late for that," the man said, his eyes narrowing. "You took something from me and no review or apology is going to bring it back." "You think I care about your review?" The woman took a deep breath as though bracing herself for the man's anger. "I get it," she said, her voice steady but filled with sorrow. "And I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that we're trying to make things right. We're not ignoring what happened." The man's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. He didn't need to hear their excuses, their attempts to justify what they had done. They didn't understand. They didn't know who he was or what he had been through. They thought they could fix it with words, but words were meaningless in this situation. The silence hung between them for a moment before the man spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "I don't want your apology," he said. "I just want you to understand something. What happened wasn't just about the dog. It was about everything else. About what I've done, what I've seen, and what I've lived through. You don't know me. You don't know what I've sacrificed." The officers exchanged a quick glance, but neither of them responded. The man could tell they were trying to process his words, trying to understand the weight behind them. But they never would. They couldn't. "I'm done talking," the man said, his voice cold. "I'll deal with this my way. You can leave now." The officers didn't argue. They nodded quietly and turned to leave. The woman glanced back one last time before walking away, her face still full of regret. The man closed the door behind them, the sound echoing in the quiet house. He didn't feel relief, though. If anything, the encounter had only stirred the emotions that he had tried to keep buried. He knew it wasn't over. The story would continue to unfold, and the world would continue to watch. He didn't know what he was supposed to do next, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let this go. He sat back down in his living room, the silence settling around him once again. The events of the past few days had set something in motion, something he couldn't stop. The world had seen him as a quiet, unassuming man, a man who had left his past behind. But now they knew, and he knew that there was no going back. Here's part 4 of the story, written in a simple, engaging, and natural tone. Days turned into weeks, but the weight of what had happened never fully lifted from the man. It hung over him like a storm cloud, always present, always threatening to burst. He spent his time in a daze, moving through the motions of daily life, but never fully engaging with the world around him. The quiet, empty house that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a prison. His dog was gone, and with it, a part of him had gone too. The neighborhood continued to whisper about the incident, though it had begun to fade from the headlines. The local news outlets had moved on to other stories, but the story of the man and his dog still lingered in the air, like an unresolved question. People still looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy, unsure of how to act around someone who had become a symbol of both loss and tragedy. But the man was no longer concerned with what others thought. He had stopped caring about the opinions of his neighbors, the reporters, or anyone who had an opinion about his life. What mattered now was the aftermath, the way everything had spiraled out of control in an instant, and the feeling that the world would never be the same again. The officers had kept their distance after their visit, but the man knew they were still watching. They were probably trying to figure out what he would do next, wondering if he would take legal action or if he would stay silent, bearing the pain inside. He had considered both options, but deep down he knew that neither would bring back his dog. Nothing would fix what had happened, and no amount of justice or retribution would change the reality of the situation. Still, the man couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unfinished, something unresolved that needed to be addressed. He had walked away from his past, hoping that it would stay buried, but this incident had forced him to confront it once again. and while he had no intention of returning to the world he had left behind, he knew that he couldn't just let this slide. The police, the officers who had killed his dog, needed to understand the consequences of their actions. They needed to understand that this was not just about a dog, but about something much bigger. One evening, as the man sat in his living room, staring blankly at the wall, the doorbell rang. It was late, later than he usually expected anyone to come calling. He wasn't in the mood for visitors, but something inside him stirred, a curiosity mixed with dread. He stood up slowly, his legs heavy, and walked to the door. When he opened it, he found a man standing there, a man he had never seen before. The man was tall, dressed in a simple black jacket and jeans, his expression serious but not unfriendly. He didn't look like a police officer, but there was something about him that made the man pause. The stranger wasn't carrying any obvious signs of authority, but there was a certain air about him, a quiet confidence that suggested he wasn't just anyone. "I need to speak with you," the stranger said. His voice was calm, steady. "It's important." The man didn't invite him inside right away. He was cautious, his instincts telling him that this wasn't a random visit. He didn't know if this man was connected to the police or if he had some other agenda. But the stranger's presence felt different. There was a weight to his words, a sense of urgency that the man couldn't ignore. "What about?" the man asked, his voice guarded. The stranger hesitated for a moment, then took a step closer. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, lowering his voice. "I know what happened to your dog. I know what the police did." The man's pulse quickened. He didn't know how this person knew about the incident, but there was something unsettling about the way he spoke. This wasn't just another person offering their condolences. This was someone who knew more than they should. "I know what they did to you, and I know that it wasn't right," the stranger continued. "But there's more to this than you realize. The police didn't act alone. There are people who knew exactly what was going to happen, and they've been covering it up." The man's mind raced. He had spent the past few weeks trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to piece together the truth from the fragmented information he had. But this was something new, something that made the whole situation feel even more complicated. "Who are you?" the man asked, his voice tight with suspicion. "And what are you talking about?" The stranger looked around quickly as if checking to see if anyone was watching, before stepping closer and lowering his voice even further. "I'm someone who knows the truth. I'm not here to threaten you, but I need you to listen. The police, they've been involved in things that go beyond simple mistakes. There's more to what happened that day than you were told, and I think you're starting to realize that." The man took a step back, trying to process what he was hearing. He had never been one to get involved in conspiracies or vague accusations. But this stranger's words struck a chord, and for a moment he wondered if there was more to the situation than just a tragic misunderstanding. "What are you asking me to do?" the man finally asked. He couldn't deny that there was something compelling about the stranger's words, something that hinted at a much larger story than he had imagined. "I'm asking you to fight back," the stranger replied, "not just for your dog, but for the truth. The system doesn't always work the way it should, and sometimes it takes someone like you to make things right." The man stared at the stranger, trying to gauge his intentions. There was something about the stranger's demeanor that suggested he was offering more than just a simple solution. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about anger. It was about something deeper, something that, if ignored, could cause more harm in the long run. "I'm not going back to that life," the man said quietly, shaking his head. "I've left all of that behind. I can't go back to that world." The stranger nodded, his expression understanding but firm. "I'm not asking you to go back to that life, but what I am asking is for you to take control of this. You don't have to do it alone. But there are people who can help. People who have been waiting for someone like you." The man stood there for a long moment, staring at the stranger, as if weighing his options. He hadn't wanted to get involved in anything like this. He had hoped that with time things would settle down, that he could put the past behind him and continue living in peace. But that wasn't going to happen, not now. The truth had a way of finding its way to the surface, whether he wanted it to or not. "I'll think about it," the man said finally, "but I can't promise anything." The stranger nodded as though he had expected this response. "That's all I'm asking. Just think about it. The truth doesn't stay buried forever." With that, the stranger turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. The man watched him go, his mind racing with thoughts he hadn't allowed himself to entertain until now. He had tried to stay out of it, to live a quiet life. But it seemed that life had other plans. The stranger's visit had stirred something inside him. A sense of responsibility, perhaps, or a feeling that he couldn't simply walk away from what had happened. The road ahead was unclear, and the man didn't know what he was going to do next. But one thing was certain: things were far from over. And no matter how much he wanted to retreat into the shadows, the world had a way of pulling him back in. Here's part 5 of the story. The days after the stranger's visit felt different. The man spent most of his time thinking about what had been said, replaying the conversation over and over in his head. At first, he had dismissed the stranger as just another person trying to manipulate him. But as the hours passed, doubt began to creep in. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that there was something to what the stranger had said. There was more at play than just the police officer's mistake. Something bigger was happening, and the man couldn't ignore it any longer. He had tried to keep his life simple, to leave his past behind, but it was clear now that his past wasn't finished with him. The events of that afternoon had pulled him back into a world he thought he had left for good. The police had made a mistake, yes, but there was more to it than just that. The man knew it, and deep down, he knew that if he didn't act, things could spiral even further out of control. The first step was figuring out who the stranger was. The man had no way of knowing if he could trust him, but the idea of someone else being involved, someone who knew about the police and the situation, made him uneasy. He had always been cautious, never fully trusting anyone, and this was no exception. But he knew that in order to move forward, he had to take the first step. He needed answers. That night, as the house fell into silence, the man made up his mind. He would go to the place the stranger had mentioned. He would find out who was really behind all of this, and he would get to the bottom of what had happened to his dog. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about justice. It was about the truth. The truth had a way of settling in the pit of his stomach, refusing to let go until it was revealed. The next morning, he left his house early, before the sun had fully risen. The streets were quiet, the world still wrapped in the haze of early morning. It felt like the right time to go, to move through the world unnoticed. The man kept to the shadows, walking with purpose but without attracting attention. His footsteps were silent, the only sound the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. The place the stranger had mentioned was on the outskirts of town, an old warehouse that looked like it hadn't been used in years. It was surrounded by overgrown weeds and rusted fences, a place that felt abandoned by time. The man's heart rate quickened as he approached. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew this was the moment when everything would change. He had no backup, no plan, but something inside told him that he had to follow through. As he reached the warehouse, he paused for a moment, scanning the area. There were no signs of life, no indication that anyone was around, but he had been in enough dangerous situations to know that appearances could be deceiving. He moved closer, his steps careful, his eyes sharp as he searched for any sign of the stranger or the people he had mentioned. The door to the warehouse was slightly ajar, and the man pushed it open slowly, careful not to make a sound. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the faint smell of old wood and rust lingering in the corners. It looked like the place had been abandoned for years, but there was a sense of life here, a quiet tension that hung in the air. The man stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light, and then he saw him. The stranger was standing near the back of the warehouse, his arms crossed, watching the man closely. There was no surprise in his eyes, no question about whether the man would show up. It was as though he had known all along that the man would come. "You came," the stranger said, his voice steady, but there was a slight edge to it. "I knew you would." The man didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, taking in the sight of the stranger. There was something about him that still didn't sit right, but he had come this far and now there was no turning back. "I'm here," the man finally said, his voice low, "because I need answers." The stranger nodded slowly, as though he had been expecting the question. "You're right to want them. What happened to your dog was only the beginning. You're not just dealing with a couple of bad cops. There's a network, a system in place that uses people like those officers to carry out their dirty work. But it's bigger than just them. It's been happening for a long time and they've been hiding it. You were the first casualty in a long line of people they've targeted." The man's chest tightened at the words. He had suspected there was more to the story, but hearing it confirmed made it all the more real. He took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. What do you mean, a network? What kind of people are we talking about here? The stranger hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. They're part of a group that's been operating for years. People in power, people who are untouchable. They have their hands in everything, from law enforcement to business to government. They pull strings, make decisions that affect the lives of ordinary people, but they don't care about the consequences. They don't care who gets hurt. They just want control. The man's mind raced. This wasn't just about his dog anymore. This was something much bigger, something that reached into places he had never imagined, the kind of thing that could destroy lives without anyone even knowing. And now he was a part of it. So what do you want me to do? The man asked, his voice steady but with a hint of doubt. What do I have to do with this? You've already done your part, the stranger replied. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time, but now you're here. And that's what matters. You're the key to exposing them. The police officers, they were just the first step. But you were part of something bigger. Your background, your training, everything you've been through, it makes you a threat to them. That's why they targeted you. The man shook his head, trying to process everything he was hearing. He had thought his days of danger and secrecy were behind him, but now it was clear that they had never really left. He was just too naive to see it. I don't want any part of this, the man said, his voice firm. I left that world behind a long time ago. I don't care about their games. The stranger stepped closer, his eyes intense. You don't have a choice, he said. You're already involved. They've marked you. You think you can walk away now? They'll come for you, for anyone who knows too much. You've already seen how far they'll go to keep their secrets. And if you don't help expose them, they'll just keep doing it. More lives will be lost and nothing will ever change. The man felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The weight of the decision hit him harder than he expected. He had thought he could escape, that he could live a quiet life, but the truth was too powerful to ignore. The stranger was right. If he didn't act, if he didn't stand up now, things would never change. The cycle of corruption would continue and more people would suffer. For the first time since everything had started, the man felt a sense of clarity. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't just sit back and let this happen. He had seen too much, been through too much to turn away now. He took a deep breath and looked the stranger in the eye. What do you need me to do? The stranger smiled, a slight but knowing smile. It's not about what I need you to do. It's about what you need to do. You already have the skills. You know how to fight. You know how to take down an enemy when they're hiding in the shadows. All you have to do is bring them into the light. The man nodded slowly, the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. It wasn't the life he had chosen, but it was the one that had chosen him. And now, he would have to face it head-on, no matter what it cost. The stranger turned and began walking toward the back of the warehouse. Come on, he said. We have work to do. The man followed, ready to face the darkness that had been creeping.